There are moments in life you simply never forget. Like that instant when the entire world collapses right in front of you, and you don't even have time to defend yourself. That's exactly what happened to me dressed as a bride, my heart racing, my dreams written across my face. I was shattered not in silence, but in front of 250 people, right there at the altar. Humiliated. Betrayed. Exposed. What should have been the beginning of my new life turned into a public nightmare, filled with scandal, lies, and abandonment. The pain felt unbearable. Shame burned through me, while the realization that I had been deceived by everyone, even by the man who swore he loved me, left me without solid ground to stand on. And the cruelest part? I was 4 months pregnant, and no one cared about the truth. That day, I made a promise to myself and to the baby quietly growing inside me that one day, all of this would make sense. That this betrayal would have an ending. And it did. Years later, it was my son who silenced them all. With the pure wisdom of a child and a gesture no one expected, he turned the key in this story. He did the impossible, turned sorrow into forgiveness, manipulation into truth, shame into redemption. This isn't just a story about a broken heart, it's about starting over. About finding strength when everything seems lost. About family, even when it needs to be reinvented. If you've ever felt deceived by someone you trusted the most, if you've ever faced abandonment at the moment you needed support more than anything, if you carry wounds no one sees but that still bleed inside, then this story is for you. Get ready. Each chapter of this journey reveals more than just pain. It reveals unconditional love. And a truth that, once spoken, could no longer be ignored. Melissa had always believed that day would be the happiest of her life. Everything was perfect, the dress carefully chosen, the vows she had rehearsed in front of the mirror, and the tender smile on her father's face as he walked her down the aisle. The church was full, 250 guests, all eyes fixed on that scene that looked as though it had been pulled straight from a fairy tale. But no one, absolutely no one, could have predicted what was about to happen. It was as if the universe had chosen that exact moment to rip apart the illusion and expose the truth, or rather, a lie dressed up as truth. And that was when everything collapsed. Margaret Richmond, the groom's mother, interrupted the ceremony with a scream dripping in false morality. In her hands, she held so-called proof of Melissa's betrayal: photos, doctored messages, carefully manipulated screenshots. It was a scandal orchestrated with cold precision, staged in front of everyone. The shock spread through the church like lightning. James, the groom, stood frozen, but all it took was one look from his mother for him to let Melissa's bouquet slip from his hands and step away from her. The humiliation was so brutal that the silence of the guests hurt more than any word spoken. No one stood up to defend her. No one questioned anything. Margaret's word, wealthy, powerful, and influential, was enough. Melissa felt the world spinning out from under her. She was 4 months pregnant, and even then she was accused, abandoned, silenced. James, so easily manipulated, chose to believe the lies rather than look into the eyes of the woman he claimed to love. It wasn't just a ruined ceremony, it was the destruction of an entire future. Her heart wasn't only broken, it was crushed. The shame wasn't only public, it was intimate. The altar, meant to be a symbol of love, had turned into a stage for rejection. And the cruelest part? Margaret knew exactly what she was doing. Every move was calculated, every detail designed to discredit Melissa and cut her out of the Richmond family. It was a silent vendetta now exploding in front of everyone. And the bride, who only seconds earlier believed she was stepping into a new life, now had to decide whether she would drown in her pain or find the strength to breathe again. While guests whispered, some shocked, others entertained by the tragic spectacle, Melissa felt something stir inside her. Not only the baby, but also a sudden, fierce urge to protect that life with everything she had. In that moment, she realized she could no longer depend on anyone. Not on James, not on vows, not on the illusion of a perfect family. Her truth didn't need applause, it needed time. Time to rise to the surface. Time to grow stronger. And above all, it needed to be told. Margaret, with the faintest satisfied smile tugging at her lips, believed she had won. But she underestimated the strength of a woman with a broken heart and a child in her womb. Many would remember that day as a scandal, a shameful scene, but for Melissa, it was ground zero for a silent, powerful rebirth. In the depths of humiliation, the seed of resilience was planted, a seed that would change everything years later. It's strange how, sometimes, the ones who push us down are unknowingly preparing us for our highest flight. What seemed like the end of everything was, in truth, the beginning of a journey that would demand courage, tears, and difficult choices. Melissa didn't know it yet, but that ruined wedding would only be the first chapter of a much greater story, one of redemption, truth, and unconditional love. And the world, which judged her in silence, would one day hear her voice echo with force. Because what Margaret tried to bury at that altar wasn't just a ceremony, it was Melissa's chance to be heard, to be respected, to be a mother with dignity. But truth always finds its way to the surface, even if it has to pass through pain, abandonment, and lies. And in this story, truth would come from the most unexpected place: the eyes of a child. Melissa's footsteps echoed alone on the cobblestone path along the side of the church, each sound betraying the pain she tried to hold back. The white dress dragged against the dirty ground, every thread of lace a cruel reminder of what should have been. Yet even with her face washed in tears, she didn't collapse, at least, not outwardly. Inside, the abyss was inevitable. She felt shattered, exposed, carrying in her arms not just public humiliation but also the responsibility of protecting a life that hadn't even begun. And it was for that life that she had to rise again. Sitting on a park bench, away from the whispers and flashing eyes, she placed her hand over her belly. 4 months. Still too early to feel kicks, but it was as if the baby understood. A subtle movement, like a touch of comfort. And there, in that silence broken only by the afternoon breeze, she made a promise. Not to the world, not to James, not to society, but to her child. I will raise you with love. And one day, you will know the truth. It was one of the most honest sentences she had ever spoken, and the most powerful. It was tempting to let herself drown in the pain, to become another statistic, to let shame consume everything. But something deep inside Melissa refused to allow it. There was something stronger than the scandal, the instinct to protect. Motherhood, even before birth, was already becoming her shield and her sword. Lies might have won for now, but truth was forming inside her. And that gave her strength. More than that, it gave her purpose. The city, with its usual rush, went on as if nothing had happened. Social columns published photos of the interrupted wedding as though it were an episode of a soap opera. The elite thrived on scandal, especially when it involved betrayal, shame, and abandonment. But Melissa didn't read any of it. She decided she wouldn't feed on the cruelty of others. Instead, she looked forward. She found shelter in a close friend's home and spent the following days reorganizing the life that was now hers alone, hers and the baby's. It was hard. As hard as trying to breathe underwater. Some nights, she cried herself to sleep. Other nights, she lay awake in silence, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how everything had collapsed so quickly. But her mind always returned to the same image: her child growing strong, head held high, unafraid of the truth. That vision kept her from falling apart completely. It was as if the promise she made on that park bench had become an anchor in the middle of the storm. And that was enough to keep her moving forward. With time, she began writing everything down in a notebook. Not as a way to vent, but as a diary for her child. She wanted him, in the future, to know who his mother truly was. She wanted him to know what had happened, but without hatred, only with clarity. Every word she wrote was a brick rebuilding her identity, no longer the abandoned bride, but the determined mother. It was the beginning of a new narrative. During that period, she learned that starting over has nothing to do with forgetting. It's about transforming. The pain was still there, but it was no longer just a wound, it was turning into fuel. The loneliness still hurt, of course, but it no longer paralyzed her. Melissa woke up every day more determined to prove that the scandal would not define her end. That a broken heart could beat even stronger. That lies, no matter how loud, would never weigh more than a mother's love. And perhaps that is one of life's greatest truths: it's not the fall that defines us, but the promise we make at the bottom. That whispered vow, voiced through tears but firm. Melissa didn't know when or how, but she was certain the truth would rise. And on that day, those who laughed first would be forced to swallow their laughter. Because she was no longer alone. And the strength born with that child would change everything. Going back to work felt like learning to walk again after a brutal fall. Every step was heavy, difficult, but necessary. Melissa returned to her position at the marketing agency with her head held high and her soul hardened by experience. She didn't ask for pity, she didn't accept looks of condescension. She walked in every day with her mind full of ideas and her heart under reconstruction. What once was just a workplace had now become a silent battlefield where she fought for respect, independence, and most of all, stability for the child growing inside her. Some colleagues avoided looking her in the eye. Others masked their curiosity with forced kindness. But Melissa refused to be affected. She quickly understood that the only narrative that mattered was hers. And this time, no one would overwrite it. She immersed herself in projects, took online courses to sharpen her skills, and little by little became a reference within the team. The same woman who had been the subject of scandal only months earlier was now being noticed for her resilience and creativity. And the most ironic part? The more they tried to erase her, the brighter she shined. Deep down, Melissa knew she still carried wounds. The lonely nights were heavy, the pregnancy nausea came laced with unwanted memories. But she discovered a new power, the power of recording. In her diary, she no longer wrote only for her child, she wrote for herself too. She kept track of days, fears, small victories, stretches of silence, and bursts of unexpected laughter. It was like building a timeline of her own strength, a parallel narrative to the one society tried so hard to impose on her. She also began recording short videos, alone in her room. They were messages for the future. Messages that one day Sam she had already started calling the baby Sam could watch with his own eyes. In those recordings, she told everything: the lies spun by his grandmother, the cowardice of his father, the shame that turned into fuel. Those recordings became her mission. She wanted her son to grow up knowing the truth not as a burden, but as a source of wisdom. An emotional inheritance built from words and honesty. As the pregnancy advanced, the challenges multiplied. Balancing work, doctor's appointments, anxiety, and solitude was exhausting. Yet something inside her was growing stronger than fear. Maybe it was unconditional love. Maybe pure survival. Or maybe both. Melissa learned to be enough for herself, and that was no small thing. When she longed for comfort, she found it within. When she craved support, she held her belly and reminded herself, I have someone worth fighting for. In that process, a version of her emerged that she never knew existed. A woman who negotiated contracts with firmness, who dressed elegantly even after sleepless nights, who greeted the doorman with genuine kindness. A woman who had once been discredited but had now become a point of reference. And the most beautiful part? She didn't pretend everything was fine. She simply refused to let pain speak louder than her dreams. That, in itself, was an act of strength. Over time, her work began to generate results that even impressed the agency directors. Clients praised her, campaigns she led went viral. It was as if her pain, now transformed, had become a creative advantage. Every piece, every text, every meeting carried the authenticity of someone who had hit rock bottom and returned to tell the story. Melissa was no longer just competent, she was inspiring. And that made all the difference. The truth was that starting over demanded more than courage. It demanded purpose. And Melissa had found hers to be the kind of mother Sam would be proud of. A woman who, even in the face of betrayal, manipulation, and abandonment, chose to move forward with dignity. What was meant to be her ruin became her reason. And every firm step she took was a silent message to the world, I didn't break, I rebuilt myself. The news came as a whisper down the hall of the building where Melissa worked. Margaret Richmond is downstairs. She laughed at first, thinking it was a cruel joke. But when she looked out the window, she saw the black car and chauffeur waiting, as if everything still revolved around her. The same woman who had destroyed her in front of 250 people was now standing at the reception desk as if nothing had ever happened. It was the first time they had seen each other since the scandal. Melissa closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and went down. Her heels struck the marble floor like a countdown. And when she stopped in front of her former mother-in-law, there was no longer the vulnerable young bride from the altar. There was a woman raised up by pain, by motherhood, and by the truth she carried as her armor. Margaret, still immaculate, still radiating arrogance, had something different in her eyes this time. Maybe surprise. Maybe fear. Without trembling, Melissa simply said, "You have 2 minutes." That short, sharp sentence dismantled any illusion of superiority Margaret still held. The meeting took place in the café inside the building, a neutral, open space where no word could turn into a scream. Margaret tried to keep her composure, starting with overly polite phrases, as if she could clean her image before addressing the real issue. But Melissa left her no room. "I didn't come here to listen to excuses, Margaret. You didn't destroy me. You only sped up my transformation." It landed like a blow of reality. For the first time, Margaret realized her manipulation hadn't won, it had only shaped an even stronger woman. Melissa never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her greatest weapon was the firmness in every word. She told in detail how she raised Sam on her own, how she rebuilt her career, how she turned public humiliation into fuel. She spoke of loneliness, of sleepless nights, of the pain of watching her son grow up without a father, not by her choice, but because of a lie born within the Richmond family. Margaret, once untouchable, began to lose color. Her eyes shifted between disbelief and guilt. But Melissa wasn't looking for remorse. She wanted to make it clear there was no more space for manipulation. She showed Margaret a photo of Sam. "This is the grandson you chose to erase. But he exists. And he is the best thing that ever happened to me." For the first time, Margaret swallowed hard. The boy was the spitting image of James, a living reflection of the truth she had tried to bury. And that hurt more than any word. Before leaving, Melissa placed an envelope on the table. "Here are copies of the records I kept since the day I was abandoned. Diaries, videos, medical exams, an entire archive of truth. One day, Sam will be old enough to read it. And he will." Margaret touched the envelope as if touching an open wound. She knew what was inside could shatter the image she had so carefully built. But in that moment, it no longer mattered. The damage had already been done by her own hands. The walk back to the elevator was silent, but filled with dignity. Melissa didn't look back. She knew she had said everything that needed to be said. And more, she knew she had won. Not out of revenge, but out of justice. That meeting wasn't just a confrontation. It was the first real turning point since the altar. She left lighter. Not because Margaret deserved forgiveness, but because Melissa had finally broken the last invisible chain tying her to the past. The most striking thing about that moment wasn't the courage to face the woman who had destroyed her. It was the serenity of someone who no longer needed to scream to be heard. Melissa didn't have to prove anything anymore. Her life spoke for itself. And every word in that conversation sealed a new chapter, where she was no longer a victim but the protagonist. Because sometimes, the most powerful confrontation isn't about victory, it's about liberation. It was on a rainy night, the kind where the noise of the world outside clashes with the silence of inner decisions, that Melissa knew the time had come. The contractions, which had started lightly that morning, grew into waves of pain and expectation. She was alone at home, as she had been throughout her entire pregnancy, but there was no panic. There was focus. She packed her bag, called the friend who would accompany her at the hospital, and hailed a cab with the calm of someone who already understood this moment would change everything. When she entered the maternity ward, her body trembled not only from labor, but from that mix of fear and raw emotion only a mother understands. Melissa had prepared for this moment as one prepares for a marathon, breathing deeply, studying each stage, but knowing nothing, absolutely nothing, can teach you what it feels like to hear the first cry. And when it came tearing through the air, like a symphony of truth, the world stopped. Samuel James Harrington, or simply Sam, was born with wide, alert eyes and a serene expression, as if he already understood more than he could say. At that moment, nothing else mattered. Not society's judgment, not Jame's abandonment, not Margaret's lies. All of it stayed outside the delivery room. What existed there was pure, raw, unconditional. Melissa looked at that tiny being and knew this was it. The motivation. The strength. The reason she hadn't fallen apart. All the chaos that preceded his birth suddenly made sense. It was as if Sam had come into the world to reorder everything. The days that followed were intense. Many people came to visit, perhaps moved more by curiosity than by empathy. But Melissa kept her distance. She didn't want her son breathing the toxic air of those who had discarded her at the altar. She preferred an environment of peace, even if small. She painted the nursery light blue, decorated it with words of courage and love, and fell asleep each night with the baby in her arms, as if protecting him from the world, and in a way, she was. Every cry from Sam awakened a new layer of strength within her. Breastfeeding, changing diapers, sleepless nights, none of it was easy, but each task carried the certainty that she was fulfilling her promise. That baby would not inherit shame. He would not inherit lies. He would grow up knowing he was born of love, even if circumstances tried to turn it into scandal. And that was what mattered most. In the records she continued to keep, Melissa narrated everything. The first words she whispered to her son, the moments of exhaustion, the smiles that appeared even on days when she had no energy. It was a testimony of unconditional love, of pure resilience. And she knew one day, when Sam was grown, he would read every word and understand that his arrival was not just a birth, it was a rebirth for her too. While many believed Melissa had lost everything, the truth was the opposite. She had gained something no scandal could ever take: the certainty that love, when real, is stronger than any manipulation. And more than that, that a broken heart could indeed become the foundation of a story of rebuilding. Sam, without even knowing it, was already teaching her about new beginnings. About the kind of strength that's born when you have something greater than pride to protect. On the birth certificate, she insisted on including both surnames. Not as an honor to the father, but as Sam's right. The truth began to take official form there. It was a small gesture, but filled with meaning. Melissa knew there was still a long road ahead. But with Sam in her arms, the future no longer frightened her. On the contrary, it pulsed with a new promise. And that promise had a name, a baby's scent, and eyes that saw beyond. Time went by quickly. In the blink of an eye, Sam was babbling his first words, pointing at things with his curious little finger, laughing with a mouth full of new teeth. Melissa, though exhausted, felt more alive than ever. The sleepless nights, the reports submitted with a baby in her lap, the meetings fueled by coffee and dark circles under her eyes, they were mere details compared to the feeling that drove her. She was winning. Little by little, she was turning pain into routine, and routine into a new life. At work, she became a reference. Her emotional intelligence, sharpened by motherhood and all the trials she had faced, was now a competitive edge. She knew how to listen, how to create, how to lead. And above all, she knew how to stand her ground. She was respected. Colleagues who once gossiped or kept their distance now admired her. She didn't have to raise her voice, her presence alone was enough to bring order. And that was the result of something no report could ever measure: resilience. With Sam growing, Melissa established small rituals. Mornings began with music and black coffee. Nights ended with made-up stories, where the characters always overcame some kind of injustice. It was her way of sowing values in her son, not by imposing them, but by showing him that truth, when well told, becomes example. The house was simple, but full of life. Drawings covered the fridge, toys scattered across the floor, and a wall filled with phrases she repeated to herself, daily reminders that there was still more ahead. But not everything was light. Sometimes Melissa noticed strange signs: flowers left at the building's entrance with no sender, silent phone calls, stares that lingered too long in public places. At first, she thought it was paranoia. Later, she realized Margaret was still watching her. Maybe from a distance, maybe still trying to control what had long slipped through her fingers. The feeling of being watched unsettled her. But instead of retreating, Melissa did the opposite. She stood even firmer. She began to fortify her surroundings. Enrolled Sam in a school that prioritized emotional development, made friends with local mothers, and strengthened her support network. She also sought therapy not because she felt weak, but because she knew staying strong required clarity. In those sessions, she revisited the pain of the altar, confronted Jameis' shadow, and pieced her story back together with sharper vision. It was like polishing a broken mirror, painful, but reflecting who she truly was. Sam was a happy child. Intelligent, sensitive, curious. His gaze captivated anyone, his questions disarmed adults. Sometimes, as she watched him play, Melissa thought of James. Not with longing, but with curiosity. Does he know his son exists? Does he feel the absence of something he's never seen? The questions came and went like wind. Melissa never let them take up too much space. The priority was the present. And the present was Sam. There were moments when the ache of what never happened stung. The lonely Sundays, the holidays where a second pair of arms was missing to share the pride of her child's milestones. But in those moments, Melissa took a deep breath and reminded herself why she had endured it all. It wasn't about having a perfect family. It was about offering a safe home. And she was doing that masterfully. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And that was enough. There are wounds that never fully disappear, but instead of being chains, they can become wings. Melissa had discovered this truth through every sleepless night, every tear shed in silence, and every moment when she chose to rise again instead of giving in. What had once been shame had turned into dignity. What had once been manipulation had turned into clarity. And what had once been betrayal had turned into strength. She no longer introduced herself as the bride who was left at the altar. That identity had died the moment she promised her child, still in her womb, that love would prevail. Now she was Melissa, mother, professional, woman of resilience. And she carried in her eyes a calm that intimidated anyone who tried to test her again. Sam grew surrounded not by lies, but by truth. He knew from his earliest years that life wasn't always fair, but that it was always possible to rise above. He inherited from his mother not just her features, but her ability to look straight into the eyes of others without fear. And one day, still a child, he said words that silenced every ghost from the past. Mom, you don't need to be sad. Because I know who you are. And that's enough for me. Those words, so simple, so pure, were the confirmation of everything Melissa had fought for. They were the redemption she had once dreamed of in the middle of her tears. The lies no longer mattered. The humiliation no longer mattered. What mattered was that the truth had survived. And it was alive in her son's voice. This story isn't just about betrayal, shame, or abandonment. It's about rebirth. It's about the kind of strength you only discover when you have no other choice but to keep moving. It's about family, even if it has to be reinvented. So if you've ever felt deceived by those you trusted most, if you've ever faced abandonment in the moment you most needed support, if you carry invisible wounds that still ache inside, then let Melissa's story be a reminder. Pain doesn't have the final word. Truth does. And when truth finally comes to light, whether through your own strength, or through the eyes of a child, it can transform everything. With time, the wounded woman gave way to the whole woman. Still carrying scars, yes, but with a light in her eyes that only those who have rebuilt themselves can carry. Melissa learned that life goes on not because we forget, but because we choose to continue. And sometimes, continuing is the most revolutionary act there is. Especially when you have a child who, without even knowing it, lights up every step of the way with unconditional love. It was an ordinary Tuesday, the lazy sun filtering through the windows, the alarm clock screaming far too early. Melissa was already in her usual rush, packing Sam's lunch, checking his school schedule, and leaving on time for an important meeting at the agency. The routine, though exhausting, had become her ally. But that day, a single phone call turned everything upside down. "Mrs. Harrington? Sam had an accident at school. We need you to come immediately." The world stopped. Her body reacted before her mind. She grabbed her purse and ran, her heart pounding, her eyes clouded with fear. At the hospital, time seemed to stretch. Melissa arrived breathless, searching for any familiar face. A nurse came toward her and explained that Sam had fallen off the playground equipment, hit his head, and was under observation. Nothing serious, but he needed to be hospitalized for precaution. Relief came with tears. When she entered the room and saw her son resting peacefully with only a few scratches, the ground returned beneath her feet. She held his hand as if she could protect him from everything, from falls, from lies, from the world. But what Melissa did not expect was that, in that same hospital, the past would come knocking at the door of the present. James. He was there. On the other side of the waiting room. His gaze distant, his face visibly older, yet marked by the same features now living on the face of the son he had never met. The moment was quick, almost surreal. A doctor had recognized him and called his name, and that was how Melissa realized this was no illusion. Time froze. And for an instant, everything went silent. James saw her. And then, through the slightly open door, he saw Sam. The impact was undeniable. The boy was his mirror. Impossible to deny. Melissa stood firm, as always. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She simply looked at him with a mix of calm and resolve. He walked closer, speechless, his face carrying years of unasked questions. "Is he mine?" was all he could say. And Melissa, without hesitation, answered, "He's what Margaret tried to hide." The conversation was brief, tense, but inevitable. James, visibly shaken, began piecing together what he had never known. Melissa wasn't looking for explanations. The truth was there, written in their son's face. And at that moment, it was stronger than any argument. James asked to see Sam. Melissa hesitated, but allowed it. She knew that encounter wasn't about her, it was about Sam. And when the boy opened his eyes and saw the man standing by his bed, he said with the simple honesty of a child, "You look like me." It struck like a blow to the chest. And also, the first step toward something new. James sat beside his son, visibly moved. He touched the boy's hand carefully, as if afraid of breaking something sacred. Melissa watched in silence, alert but calm. There was still so much unresolved, but this moment wasn't for confrontations. It was to recognize that time makes us pay for our choices, and sometimes, it also offers a chance for redemption, even if late. That night was long. James stayed at the hospital, quiet, next to Sam. Melissa didn't know what to think. Part of her wanted to keep her distance. Another part remembered the promise she made years ago the truth would come out. And now it was in the most unexpected way. The child born of abandonment was now the bond that could rewrite an entire story. But there was still much to be said. And the most surprising part was yet to come. Margaret Richmond had always seemed untouchable. Impeccable posture, precise words, influence everywhere in the city. But what time teaches slowly and relentlessly is that no one escapes the consequences of their own manipulation. And her reckoning came in the form of chest pain, sudden breathlessness, and collapse in the hospital lobby while James was still with Sam. When the doctors confirmed it was a heart attack, Margaret's world finally stopped. And there, in the ICU bed, between wires and monitors, something inside her began to break. It was James who called Melissa, unsure why. Perhaps because he had no one else to trust. Perhaps because, somehow, he knew she was the only one capable of helping his mother face the past. Melissa hesitated, of course. But she went. Not for Margaret, but for Sam. And for herself. In the cold hospital room, standing before the woman who had once crushed her with lies, she didn't bring resentment, she brought truth. And that truth slowly began to chip away at what little pride Margaret still had left. Margaret, frail, her voice weak, her eyes wet with tears, asked to be alone with Melissa. The tension was palpable. The woman who once controlled everything could now barely hold herself up. And there, in that room, came what no one expected: the confession. She began with a simple, almost whispered phrase: "I knew you never betrayed my son." It was like a stone being lifted off a chest. Melissa didn't respond. She just waited. She wanted to hear it all. Through pauses, tears, and broken glances, Margaret confessed how she had forged the betrayal. She had hired a private investigator, manipulated photos, paid one of James' ex-girlfriends to fake incriminating conversations. All to tear them apart. Not because she hated Melissa, but because she thought Melissa wasn't worthy of the Richmond name. "You weren't one of us," she said, not realizing that this had been the root of everything: prejudice, control, arrogance. And now the price. She also admitted that in the years since, she had watched everything. She knew about the pregnancy. She knew about the birth. She had seen photos of Sam. She recognized the Richmond blood in him. But pride had been stronger than remorse. Until now. Because time had run out. Margaret knew she needed to speak. That if she didn't, the truth would die with her and turn into a curse. So she handed Melissa an envelope, the same kind she once used to destroy her at the altar, but now with a different content: receipts, contracts of bribery, saved conversations. Proof. Melissa didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply took the envelope and said, "You should have thought of this before." But instead of leaving, she stayed. She touched the shoulder of the woman who had nearly ruined her life and said something Margaret never expected: "It's still not too late to fix something. If it's for the truth." And those words, coming from Melissa, were the first ray of light to break through Margaret's wall of guilt. Because forgiveness sometimes begins even before it is deserved. In the days that followed, Margaret underwent tests and remained under intensive care. James, now more present, split his time between the hospital and Melissa's house to see Sam. But the envelope now in the right hands changed everything. Melissa knew there was still much to resolve. But for the first time, she had proof of the manipulation. The lie was finally naked. And with it, the chance to turn the page once and for all. It's strange how truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds a way. Sometimes it arrives through pain. Other times, through shame. But when it comes, it changes everything. Margaret, lying in that hospital bed, might never erase what she had done. But by confessing, she began a new path, not one of absolution, but of redemption. And that path was only possible because Melissa chose something greater than revenge. She chose not to repeat the cycle. Children carry a wisdom adults spend their lives trying to understand. They don't weigh intentions, they don't cling to old grudges, they don't build walls before seeing bridges. And Sam, with his wide, curious eyes, was exactly that. He didn't understand all the details of what had happened between his parents, nor did he need to. All he had to do was observe. Feel. And what he saw, in those days after James' return and Margaret's hospitalization, was a different kind of movement around him. A movement he himself would unknowingly complete. James started showing up often. He brought books, toys, and a face caught between guilt and a desperate will to make up for lost time. Melissa watched cautiously. This wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about respecting time, and more than anything, protecting Sam. But the boy, with the ease only children possess, never built barriers. When James arrived, he ran to show him a drawing. When his father read him a story, he listened intently. There was no demand, only presence. And little by little, that began to change everything. One afternoon, sitting between them, Sam asked a simple question, the kind only children can ask: "Why did it take you so long to find me, Dad?" James swallowed hard. Melissa froze. But before either of them could answer, Sam added, "It's okay. You're here now." And in that moment, the room filled with something no words could contain: forgiveness. A forgiveness that hadn't even been asked for, but had already been given. Melissa looked at her son and, for a second, felt the weight of years of pain dissolve. Not vanish, but lose its grip. Sam was teaching her, with his innocence, What so many adults never manage to practice: the lightness of acceptance, the freedom of beginning again. It didn't erase the past, but it opened space for something new. Something that could only exist with courage and unconditional love. James cried. For the first time, in front of Melissa and his son. Not as someone begging for pity, but as someone finally realizing the magnitude of what he had lost. He apologized not out of obligation, but because he needed to. And Melissa, her heart stitched together by years of silence, responded with a simple gesture. She placed her hand over Sam's, which was already holding his father's. In that moment, something formed, something that had no name yet, but already had meaning. Margaret, still recovering, heard about Sam's gesture days later. And for the first time in a long time, she cried without resistance. That disarmed her more than any criticism, more than any confrontation. The grandson she once tried to erase was now the one offering her the chance to rewrite her story. Not with speeches or excuses, but with love. Because only genuine love can make space for real forgiveness. Melissa began to understand that forgiveness wasn't an absolution of the past. It was a choice for the present. And Sam, with his purity, was the living reminder that some truths don't need to be shouted, they only need to be lived. He didn't ask about the altar, or the chaos of the adults. He only wanted to know if he could play soccer with his dad on Sunday. And that, in the end, was what truly mattered. The simplicity of being together. This wasn't the end of a conflict, but the beginning of a new kind of relationship. One built carefully, with respect and adjustments, but with something that had been missing before: truth. And as Melissa watched her son smile between them, she knew that despite everything, she had won. Not because she had gotten James back, but because she had built a space where Sam could grow in peace. With love. With history. And with wisdom. The doctors were clear: Margaret needed a high-risk heart surgery, and the sooner it was done, the better her chances of survival. The problem wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The woman who once ruled everything with an iron hand was now vulnerable, dependent, forced to face a decision that had nothing to do with power, money, or influence. For the first time, Margaret would have to rely on something she had never truly valued: affection. And ironically, the strength she lacked came from where she least expected: from the grandson she once tried to erase. In the days before the surgery, Margaret oscillated between silence and nostalgia. James visited often, but it was Sam who managed to draw genuine reactions from her. He talked about superheroes, showed her his drawings, and from time to time, released phrases that melted her defenses. "Grandma, when you get better, can we go to the park?" There was no demand. Only hope. And that hope, carried by unconditional love, began to do what medicine alone could not. Melissa, despite everything, stayed present. Not out of obligation, but by choice. She knew the surgery was also an emotional turning point. If Margaret survived, and Melissa hoped she would, there would be a real chance for rebuilding. Even if nothing could erase the past, Melissa believed in the possibility of something new, even if imperfect. That was maturity. That was love transformed into wisdom. On the eve of the procedure, Margaret asked to be alone with Sam. The conversation was short but unforgettable. She held his small hand firmly and whispered, "You changed everything, you know?" Sam only smiled. And before leaving the room, he left one of his drawings on her pillow, a red heart with 3 people holding hands. In that simple child's gesture, there was more forgiveness than in 1,000 formal speeches. Margaret stared at the paper for long minutes. There lay her reason to try again. The surgery lasted more than 4 hours. An eternity for those waiting outside. Melissa and James, seated together for the first time in years, exchanged few words. But something was different. It wasn't romantic reconciliation. It was complicity. A silent truce born of shared concern. Both knew that if Margaret made it out alive, something would have to change, and quickly. The past had screamed too loudly already. It was time to be silent and rebuild. When the doctor finally emerged and confirmed the surgery had been successful, the relief was collective. James cried. Melissa closed her eyes and thanked silently. And Sam slept in his mother's arms, as if he already knew everything was slowly falling into place. The most symbolic moment, however, came days later, when Margaret woke up and asked to see the drawing again. She kept it on her nightstand. And with a frail voice, she told James the first want to be part of this. But the right way this time. Recovery was slow, but full of small victories. Margaret began joining conversations more, asked questions about Sam, told stories of James as a child. For the first time, Melissa saw her as a real person full of flaws, but also capable of growth. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about allowing transformation to happen. And deep down, it was about honoring the gift life had given them the chance to change before it was too late. Sam's simple drawing had become a symbol. It was framed in Margaret's room. And every time she looked at it, she remembered that despite all the manipulation, lies, and pain she had caused, there was still a chance to do things differently. To be a grandmother. To be human. And that chance hadn't come from merit, but from grace. The grace of a child who could forgive with his eyes, even without understanding it all. Starting over is never about erasing the past. It's about deciding what to do with it. And that's exactly what began to happen between Melissa, James, and Margaret. Slowly, like a puzzle with mismatched pieces, they found ways to coexist. There were no grand promises, no rehearsed speeches. It was something subtler, yet more powerful presence. And that presence, steady and quiet, began weaving a new dynamic none of them would have thought possible years earlier. James became more involved in Sam's life. He picked him up from school, helped with homework, made sure to attend parent-teacher meetings. At first, Melissa kept her guard up. It wasn't easy to trust someone who had once turned his back without question. But seeing her son laugh beside his father slowly broke down defenses she didn't even realize she still held. Sam's unconditional love worked like a solvent, dissolving the pride that clung to everyone around him. Margaret, still recovering, began attending therapy. By choice. Something unimaginable for the woman who once controlled everything with an iron hand. But she understood even if late that to rebuild, she had to first dismantle. In those sessions, she faced her roots: the fear of losing her son, the pride that blinded her, the shame she took too long to admit. And that slow, painful process was transforming the rigid matriarch into a grandmother she had never been. One afternoon, Sam came home with a new drawing. It showed a house with 3 windows and a garden. In each window, he had written a name: Mom, Dad, and Grandma. Melissa cried. Not out of sadness, but relief. That simple paper symbolized everything she had built with courage: a space where truth could live. Where love wasn't conditioned by the past, but committed to the present. Where Sam could grow with real, human, imperfect but present role models. Melissa and James didn't go back to being a couple. At least, not then. But they walked side by side as parents. Relearning to talk, to share decisions, to build trust on new ground. Without haste, without labels, without unrealistic expectations. It was a different kind of reconciliation, one built on responsibility, respect, and a shared commitment to Sam's well-being. And in the end, that meant more than any romantic vows. Margaret began visiting Sam regularly. She brought cakes she baked herself, helped with homework, and most importantly listened. She sat on the floor, played dominoes, and gave her full attention to his stories, knowing she had lost too much time already. Melissa watched it all cautiously, but without resistance. She wasn't naive, but she wasn't a prisoner of bitterness either. She knew forgiveness, when practiced with clear boundaries, was a form of wisdom. And she chose it. Over time, their differences became only details. What had once been a battlefield was now approached with maturity. Because each of them, in their own way, had understood that the priority was Sam. And that his future depended on what they chose to build together or destroy again. Melissa, with her firmness and love, was the bridge. James, with his presence and real remorse, was the crossing. And Margaret, with her unexpected change, was the piece that completed the circle. Reconciliation, after all, isn't about returning to what was. It's about creating something new from the pieces that remain. Something stronger, something truer. And when that construction is built on love, even a painful kind, it has the power to last. Because it doesn't stand on appearances, but on truth. And that was exactly what began to blossom among them, a real new beginning. Sam's 5th birthday was more than just a celebration, it was a symbol. For the first time, everyone was together: Melissa, James, and even Margaret. The scene was simple, but heavy with meaning. Colorful balloons, homemade cake, drawings spread around, and an energy only genuine presence can create. Sam ran among the guests with pure joy, as if this was the safest place in the world. And it was. Melissa watched it all with teary eyes. Not out of longing for the past, but out of confirmation of the present. James was helping with decorations. Margaret brought cupcakes she had baked herself. The exchanged looks spoke louder than words. There was respect. There was space. There was care. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but about transforming pain into something possible, something good. During the birthday song, Sam pulled the three of them close. "Everybody together," he said, with the simplicity of someone who doesn't need explanations. And there, holding hands around the cake, Melissa understood this was family. Not the traditional one, but the kind built with courage, forgiveness, and presence. A family that, though mended, was whole where it mattered most, in love. Not every story that begins with betrayal, abandonment, and scandal needs to end in tragedy. Sometimes, it's the crooked paths that lead us to the most powerful destinations. Melissa had been humiliated before 250 guests, pregnant, wounded, alone. But she didn't collapse. She rose and step by step, rebuilt everything. She raised her son with love, upheld truth with dignity, and with a silent strength, turned every scar into a root. Samuel was the turning point. The innocent wisdom of a child silenced the oldest lies. He showed that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's maturity. That family doesn't need to follow formulas, it can be reinvented, day after day, with courage and presence. James redeemed himself not with promises, but with actions. Margaret, once proud and manipulative, bowed before the truth and was reborn as a grandmother. And Melissa, above all, proved that a broken heart can become the firmest foundation for building a new home. Now think about it. How many times have you let a wound define what came next? How many times have you believed that what broke you would be the final point of your story? This journey shows us that the end only comes when you give up turning the page. And that forgiveness, even when it feels impossible, can be the bridge between who we were and who we can become. If this story touched you, reminded you of something, or perhaps inspired you to see your own new beginning differently, then you need to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, you'll find many other real, deep, and transformative stories like this, stories that heal, teach, and strengthen. Stories you deserve to hear. Because life isn't made only of falls. It's made of the strength of those who choose to rise again. Who choose to begin again with truth, with love, and with the courage to be real. And have you thought about which chapter of your story you can still begin again?